and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Jason Momoa is back as Aquaman, forced to team up with his brother Patrick Wilson to find the Lost Kingdom, but does this final DC adventure at least end this cinematic universe with some degree of dignity? Arthur Curry, aka Aquaman, played by Jason Momoa, is juggling the responsibility of being a new father with being the king of Atlantis, alongside his wife Mira, played by Amber Heard. Meanwhile, David Kane, aka Black Manta, played by Yahya Abdul-Mateen II, still seeking revenge against Aquaman, finds a black trident that gives him the knowledge of the lost kingdom of Necrus, and begins harvesting orichalcum, rapidly escalating the effects of climate change. Arthur is forced to free his brother Orm, played by Patrick Wilson, from his desert prison to find Manta before he drives the world to extinction. The DC Cinematic Universe officially concludes with Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom. This is it. This is the full stop, or at least as we know it today. In a few years' time, James Gunn is going to reboot the DC properties, and who knows what that will look like, but for now, this is the end. Which is a bit of an unfortunate thing to put on Aquaman 2 because it clearly wasn't intended to be a finale in any way, shape or form. The DC Cinematic Universe has had a very rocky history, to say the least. If you've been a long-time follower of mine, you know that I've had a very, very conflicted history with the Snyder films that started off this cinematic universe. I thought they were very shaky foundations to build upon, and it turns out that was exactly the case. And once Snyder departed, largely DC has been defined by a lack of cohesive identity, which in some ways is actually kind of liberating next to Marvel, where every single movie is clearly meant to be the next chapter, the next installment, and clearly very planned, whereas DC largely did whatever the hell it wanted. And so sometimes those experiments did actually work out in the case of something like Aquaman or Shazam, and then other times you get complete and total dross like Suicide Squad from 2016. The problem is that the DC Cinematic Universe just didn't know what it wanted to be, and ultimately just existed largely to compete with Marvel. And Aquaman 2 arrives in the midst of Discovery's buyout of Warner Bros., but also that it's a full year after its original intended release date of December 2022, which has allowed an entire year of rumours to swirl around the production, that it's deeply troubled, that it's filled with reshoots, the editing bay is in turmoil, Amber Heard's out of the movie, no she isn't. All this stuff has bubbled up around it, and everyone's primed for it to be a Flash-level disaster, and I hate to burst your bubble, but Aquaman 2 is fine. It's not great, but it isn't terrible. It's just kind of there, and I think in that way, it's very emblematic of superhero movies at this present moment, which have very much lost their event status and are just things that happen every couple of weeks now to increasing audience apathy. And for the record, I liked the original Aquaman. I thought it was a refreshing change for DC's movies at the time, especially coming off of the back of the Snyder films, which were very grim and self-serious, whereas Aquaman embraced a sense of fun and humour about itself, which it honestly needed, because the popular conception of Aquaman in many people's eyes is, tee, that guy that talks to fish. Everyone thinks of the Super Friends version of the character, hence the overcompensatory casting of Jason Momoa in the role, the most hench dude you can think of. And even the new film opens with voiceover narration that goes along the lines of, yeah, I talk to fish, but also I'm good at one other thing, cracking people's heads open. But I think the one thing that really worked about the original Aquaman was having James Wan as a director. James Wan, coming off the back of the Conjuring movies, you wouldn't necessarily think that he would be suited for a superhero film, but actually, he just felt right for it. He did bring some of his horror bona fides to the movie, but largely he seems to embrace the opportunity of being able to create an underwater Star Wars. And if nothing else, Aquaman, the original, looks great. The way that he built that world on screen, it's visually quite stunning. Yeah, It's not quite up to the level of, say, James Cameron's Avatar, but certainly it invites the flashy colours that you associate with comic books. It's a really visually dynamic movie. It just seemed like it was everyone on the same page and embracing the sheer ridiculousness of it all. Aquaman was just straight up camp. And with one behind the camera, it's perhaps not a surprise to say that Aquaman 2 is largely consistent with the original. It's the typical sequel thing. It's the same movie but bigger, if not necessarily better. That being said though, there are a couple of things that The Lost Kingdom does better than its predecessor, but it also takes several steps back in other areas, unfortunately. If nothing else, though, it is undeniably a James Wan movie, in an era where so many superhero films feel like they steamroll even talented directors and make them feel anonymous. At least the Aquaman movies feel like something that came from James Wan. So much of his personality comes through in these movies. It almost feels like he's kind of giggling behind the camera at just how much he's being allowed to get away with. He puts some very strange things in front of the camera, largely because the fantastical setting allows him to do whatever the hell he wants. You want a spy cephalopod in your movie to accompany Aquaman for much of the running time? Here you go. You want John Rhys-Davies to come back as a crustacean warrior that keeps losing his arm? Well, guess what? That's in the movie too. You want Martin Short to turn up as a Jabba the Hutt knockoff? It's in the movie. James Wan is just indulging every whim he possibly can, and it feels like he actually doubles down on the Star Wars and Lord of the Rings comparisons. That is what he wants to emulate, just underwater, and I think he makes that abundantly clear by the time that he has that Jabba the Hutt knockoff scene in a knockoff cantina. And while maybe it doesn't get quite as weird as its predecessor, it's still a movie where Jason Momoa rides the back of a giant seahorse, and it helps that Momoa himself embraces the anything goes atmosphere. He's played the character so many times by this point that he's pretty relaxed in the role. I think it also helps that Momoa is clearly incorporating elements of himself to the characterization. Momoa has a story credit and he's clearly contributed a fair bit, especially the idea of Arthur being a father. He's managing that with being the king of Atlantis, and he's kind of struggling to juggle all that. He spoke about in the PR interviews how the recurring joke of the baby peeing in his face is actually inspired by his real life, although I've got to be honest, that's a cheap joke that I've seen in a lot of movies before now, but nevertheless, that shows that he wants to embrace the character and enjoy himself. He has that kind of devil-may-care attitude that makes him fun, but also makes it understandable why Arthur isn't really suited to traditional kingly duties. He's not a politician. He doesn't come from the underwater world, and there's a bit of that tension going on. He's very much someone that uses his force to try and solve his problems. Unfortunately, he doesn't really use diplomacy. That's always been a bit of a deficiency on his part. Luckily though, the film doesn't focus too much on aquatic politics. Although speaking of politics, what Momoa has contributed is clearly an even greater emphasis on its environmental stance, even more than the first movie, to the point where it's frankly unavoidable. Lost Kingdom is explicitly a movie about climate change. The big plot device in the film is the orichalcum, which is being harvested by Black Manta, who wants to use it to destroy the world. And this orichalcum was used by the titular Lost Kingdom of Necrus, and it's basically shown as being a destructive, corrupting force. As Manta uses it, it effectively speedruns the effects of climate change. There are several moments where characters sit down in front of the television and see breaking news of huge natural disasters happening at a frightening and unprecedented rate. It's meant to echo what we're seeing right now in our present moment. Of course, it's not a perfect allegory because the effects of climate change, unlike in this movie, are not something that are going to be rapidly reversed by the end of the running time. I know this is a very unflattering comparison, but it actually reminded me of Superman 4. No, I'm not trying to say it's anywhere near as bad as that movie, but certainly it reminded me of how star Christopher Reeve was also involved with the story of that movie and wanted to promote an anti-nuclear weapons message, in the same way that Momoa is involved in the story story here and wants a climate change message in it. And that comparison is only further reinforced by the fact that both films have a sequence where they address the UN. That's right, they actually evoke Superman 4 to a certain extent, which is probably not the greatest thing to remind the audience of. You can kind of admire both of those movies, even though they're deeply imperfect for their attempt to try and incorporate commentary in the realms of a superhero movie. Although with all that being said, this entire subplot of Aquaman wanting to reveal the existence of Atlantis to the rest of the world and use their technology to try and fix its problems is very reminiscent of Black Panther, where he too wanted to reveal Wakanda to the rest of the world and use their advanced technology to try and fix the world's problems. Oh, and also ended with a scene revealing their existence to the UN. I feel like the fact that it keeps reminding me of other movies is a bit of a bad thing. Despite what has been rumoured, Amber Heard is very much still in the movie in a prominent role. She actually has third billing. I think a lot of people assumed she was going to be almost entirely cut out or reduced to a borderline cameo like Margot Kidder in Superman 3 or Kelly Marie Tran in The Rise of Skywalker. She's not given that treatment here. She's in all of the movie, or at least most of it. She does largely sit out the film's second act, and the story isn't focused upon her character as much as it was in the first movie, but that's largely because it is just going in a different direction. But Heard comes back for the third act, and she's very much involved with the action. In fact, that's actually the weird thing about Mira in this movie, in that I do think she has noticeably less dialogue than she did in the first movie, and largely the character exists in action sequences and saves Aquaman at several points in ways that cannot be removed. It feels like Heard has had her dialogue cut on occasion. There's moments where Heard is present in scenes, but she doesn't speak, and sometimes that can be a little bit distracting. I don't know if that was any conscious effort on anyone's part, but it's just a little bit odd. Although I do think that in general there is a bit of a reduced focus on the women. Nicole Kidman returns as the former queen, but she's only in a handful of scenes and sits out the big finale, and it does feel like Kidman's largely here because of contractual obligation. Missing in action entirely is Willem Dafoe. There's not even a line of dialogue acknowledging his absence. He's just simply not there this time. Although, as much as I love Willem Dafoe, I don't think he really added very much to the first movie, and certainly that's clear because I didn't really feel his absence at all, especially because what seemed to be his role has been given to Dolph Lundgren, returning as one of the kings of the underwater kingdoms, and I gotta admit, I'm a sucker for Dolph Lundgren getting a bit more to do. It's always fun to see him in ridiculous red long hair, and he seems to be enjoying getting a prominent role in a big blockbuster that isn't named The Expendables. And Yahya Abdul-Mateen II also returns as Black Manta, finally getting the payoff to his role in the earlier movie being a stand-up to the main villain in this one. And Abdul-Mateen does provide a very intense performance. He has a lot of presence in the role, certainly, but it seems like it's trying to compensate for the fact that the writing for Manta is very one-dimensional. In case you forgot, Manta wants revenge on Aquaman for the death of his father, and he will burn the world down if he thinks that that will get to him personally. He acquires the Black Trident, and clearly they wanted to try and do something interesting here in that the Trident is corrupting him and taking him down this even more terrible path where he will just commit genocide just as a way of getting back for the death of his father. But there's not a lot of nuance to the role. The idea that the Trident's corrupting him, he's already so absolute in his desire to hurt Aquaman and find retribution that really, it doesn't feel like he changes over the course of the film. It doesn't feel like it's making him do anything that he wouldn't already be doing in the first place. His best scenes are largely when he has to interact with Randall Park as a scientist working for him, who gets increasingly uneasy about that proposition and starts to become a turncoat, and Park largely provides a bit of welcome comic relief in these scenes, but also someone for actually him to bounce off of a lot of the time. You know, having that lighter character going up against someone that is so extreme in their beliefs, that actually makes him a little bit more threatening and scary. That works. Unfortunately, a lot of the time, he just feels like a generic villain. He's not really given enough nuance in his characterization for this to really work. But for me, the best part of the movie was another returning cast member, and that's Patrick Wilson as Arthur's brother Orm, who you might recall was the big bad guy in the last Aquaman they had to fight for the throne. Here, he has to break him out of prison and work alongside him, and effectively the middle act becomes a buddy comedy between the two. Wilson has long been Wan's good luck charm. They've worked together numerous times on the Insidious and Conjuring movies. It feels like they're very much on the same wavelength. And so Wilson is effectively a straight man to Momoa, but also has a kind of deadpan humour, especially in kind of his physicality. A recurring gag is the fact that Orm, because he's lived his life entirely underwater, he's not really familiar with the surface world or how to actually interact with it. There's a very physical gag where Wilson spends a lot of his early scenes running around with his arms just bolt straight until it's corrected. It's such a funny run, and that's the kind of thing that Wilson just does, just completely deadpan, and it works so well opposite Momoa. One of the complaints I had about the earlier movie is that Hurd and Momoa didn't really work very well together in the middle section of that movie. Their chemistry was a little bit lacking, whereas Wilson and Momoa, on the other hand, have a great comic timing between each other. And this comparative brotherly dynamic is very derivative when it comes to comic book movies, so much so the movie even points it out for you. At one point, Aquaman actually calls him Loki, jokingly, acknowledging the fact this is blatantly trying to replicate the dynamic between Thor and Loki in those movies, and it is rather striking how much this reminded me of Thor the Dark World. Again, not a very flattering comparison, considering that was largely considered one of the weaker MCU entries, or at least it was before this year and Quantumania came out, but even so, I do think that if you are going to blatantly try and emulate something, you could do far worse than trying to copy the dynamic between Hemsworth and Hiddleston in those movies, and I think that Momoa and Wilson are up to the task. They work together really well, and humour is one of the great strengths of Aquaman. They are genuinely funny together, especially in scenes where Momoa is trying to dupe him into eating cockroaches. That dynamic elevates the movie when it threatens to become a completely generic comic book exercise, but it also reveals how much these superhero movies are starting to eat their own tail. It is very much feeling like something that we've seen numerous times before, and Aquaman doesn't really bring a lot of its own ideas to the table. If there is a disappointment here, it's the action sequences, which should be one of the things that sets a superhero movie apart and was one of the big strengths of the earlier movie. Aquaman 2's action set pieces are well orchestrated and perfectly fine on their own terms. They're just not very memorable. I feel like Wan has fallen prey to the sequel curse in these trying to outdo himself. He makes them bigger and more bombastic, throws explosions across the screen, more characters, more fighting, and it just ends up making them feel clustered. And worse, I feel like some of the action sequences are overextended. There's too much focus on them to the point where they start becoming repetitive. There's a middle act set piece where Patrick Wilson gets blasted 4 times over the course of that sequence. That's too many times to keep knocking that character out of the action like that. It makes it feel like we're in a Groundhog Day loop. I think what's missing here is a sense of ambition. You think back to the first movie and that big fight scene in Sicily, which was largely staged in a continuous free-flowing shot, which obviously was stitched together from several takes, but even so, that was a really dynamic use of the camera on Wan's part, and it made that sequence exceptionally distinctive and memorable. There's nothing really like that in Lost Kingdom. The action set pieces feel more perfunctory this time out. Wan isn't really doing much with the camera that's especially memorable. It feels like the inspiration behind the first movie is kind of been lost. The typical sequel thing of trying to recapture the magic, but not quite getting there. So yes, it does have a lot of bang for your buck, but it feels emptier and less creative. And while it doesn't look like a complete hack job like the 2016 Suicide Squad movie did, it does feel like occasionally it has had a little bit of too many cooks in the kitchen when it comes to the editing. There might have been some post-production tampering, especially to bring the running time down to 2 hours, given that it is a little bit shorter than the first movie. There are occasionally points where it seems a little bit jumpy. In the third act of the movie, they're waiting for the army to fight them, and then suddenly they're there in the space of a couple of seconds. Things like that. There's also a couple of moments that clearly betray it. They backtracked on certain decisions, the most obvious of which is when a character is attacked by Black Manta near the end of the film that clearly was meant to be fatal. They clearly intend to kill the character off in that moment as a shock to the audience and then decide against it, and added in an ADR line from Manta saying, "I'm leaving you alive so Aquaman can watch you die." And then when the other characters find this person, there's some really clumsy editing, especially a jarring slow motion shot that clearly wasn't intended to be, to obviously cover up the fact that we were meant to find this character dead in that moment. And then obviously the subsequent scenes are a reshoot, and you get these ADR lines just to confirm that, and you go, "His condition has stabilized, I can see his parachute, he's okay." It's that kind of stuff. I had fun with Aquaman 2. I think it's largely consistent with the earlier film, but it's also forgettable. It's very emblematic of superhero films at this point in time. Big, expensive, with sometimes questionable CGI, and strangely disposable. In some ways, it feels like it's missed its moment. The original Aquaman came out in 2018, and that's half a decade ago now. A lot has passed in that time, and I know the delay wasn't entirely its own fault. There were circumstances, we're very aware of that, but even so, it arrives at a point in time where audiences' interest in superhero films is starting to wane. Even the MCU is starting to show signs of vulnerability. It's all looking a bit precarious, and Lost Kingdom isn't going to turn the tide. If you are a fan of the character, who probably isn't going to be immediately rebooted into the DC universe anyway, at least you've got a pair of perfectly respectable and entertaining movies, and it doesn't end the DC cinematic universe on an embarrassing note. And that's pretty much all you could ask for, really. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page, or with YouTube's Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. You can find my social medias on my Linktree page, or you can turn the tide at my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, or you can simply like, share and subscribe. It all helps. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.